Started, I want to start by saying good morning and welcome everyone to Generates Health 13th webinar, Navigating COVID for Moms and Babies, from Trauma to Community Healing. My name is Laura Gully. I'm the Director of Community Mobilization and Advocacy for Generate Health. As customary, before we get started, I wanted to share some housekeeping information. Because of the number of attendees, we've muted all lines. However, we do encourage your questions and information sharing. So please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen to send us your questions, and we will address them after the panelists have spoken. Next, we will use the chat box for information and resource sharing, and we will capture that information and send it out after the call. So we are recording this webinar so it can be shared with others later. And I do want to just encourage folks to use the chat to say hello to us, let us know that you're out there, you're in the space and you're listening. Just to give you a little background about Generate Health, we're a maternal and child health coalition, and our mission is to mobilize the region to advance racial equity in pregnancy outcomes, family well-being, and community health. We see our role in this crisis to continue to convene the maternal and child health community, to share information about how people and pregnant and postpartum women are at risk of COVID, coordinating resources and responding to the needs of service providers and community members, and to identify collective action opportunities. You are in for a treat today. Today's webinar will focus on trauma and healing. We would like to discuss the care needed for our community during this turbulent time, tap into our base of resiliency, and offer up ideas for what actions and preparations are needed to move towards healing. So our panelists will help us understand community trauma, provide information on initiatives underway to build a foundation of resilience and move us towards healing. And of course, ways we can all get involved. So I'll introduce our panelists up front so we can move more seamlessly between our speakers. First, we'll begin with Lady Ashley. Lady Ashley Gregory, who's the Director of Community Partnerships for Forward Through Ferguson, is an activist and educator specializing in community, equity, and inclusion. She's a native of St. Louis and the grandniece of the late civil rights activist, Dick Gregory. Yeah, you heard it, Dick Gregory. Lady Ashley uses her work to focus on bringing awareness and dismantling all forms of oppression that affect communities of color. She loves her community unapologetically, but admits we've got a lot of work to do here. And you can see, she likes to say, who's doing the work that helps her to kind of fuel her hope. Lady Ashley works to uplift communities through teachings of resistance, self-care, collective action. She believes we must all get free together through fighting the good fight to bring about change. So welcome, Lady Ashley. Then next we'll hear from Keisha Davis. She's the Director of Partnership and Capacity Building with the Deaconess Center for Child Wellbeing. Keisha leads grant making within the Foundation's program portfolio, as well as provides capacity building support and relationship management with funded and prospective partners. Keisha has worked in multiple philanthropic institutions managing portfolios that service underserved communities in the areas of behavioral health, early childhood, and community-based programs. She has led trainings and presentations on philanthropic redlining, arts and social justice grant-making practices, and authored featured articles that advocate for the dismantling of inequitable philanthropic funding practices. Keisha clearly holds a passion for creating equitable opportunities for communities of color. Thank you for being here, Keisha. And last but certainly not least, we will hear from Steve Parrish, a longtime community organizer and advocate who's worked closely with Generate Health and Flourish over the past few years. Steve is a member of the Community Health Worker Coalition, Black Healers Collective, and actively advocates for resiliency, healing, and cultural competency. He is most passionate about building solutions that honor the rights of community to have self-determination. So we will answer your questions after the presentations. So please enter your questions in the Q&A during the presentation, and then they will be answered at the end of the presentation. So you may also use the chat boxes for sharing any resources, and let us know, that you're represented in the space today. So before I turn it over to the panelists, I wanted to just share with you why this topic of trauma and healing is so relevant today. Our region, our country, and across the globe are not only experiencing this pandemic that is certainly exposing us to the inequities and the disparities that many of us knew existed, but may be unwilling or unable to shift. So we're faced with the question about who we are and who we're going to be. All across our country, and I venture to say here in St. Louis, we've acknowledged the full experience of that African Americans, of African American culture, and the multi-century history of oppression and denial of opportunity. If the killing of Michael Brown and the uprising of Ferguson taught us anything, it was that there is significant residue of historical trauma, and that more must be done to chart a new path for changing those conditions. So I heard the saying, healing cannot exist without justice. What will it take for us to heal at the core and truly begin changing conditions for moms, babies, and families of St. Louis? So I want to open the door for our panelists to address some of these issues and concerns of how we move from trauma to healing. Lady Ashley, you're up first.
Awesome. Yeah, so I, as like a Black woman, live in a world of multiple truths. And one of those multiple truths is that healing cannot exist without justice. It must encompass the multiple interwoven truths that exist in that same space. So I think a step towards moving towards that healing and changing the core to change the conditions is first acknowledging like truths, like the full history of our community, which a lot of it is traumatic of like BIPOC communities, so Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. What has been done systemically to our communities and within our communities themselves, but also within white communities that pushes that narrative forward. Many people still ignore or disregard the lived experiences of individuals and communities of BIPOC folks. And I personally don't feel that the same level of humanity has been reached or looked at within those communities as they are in white communities. And so we haven't gotten the equity that is needed and that is deserved. I feel that harm has to be acknowledged by individuals and communities as well as the government. We need to do some self-work. But we also beyond that need to start the acknowledgement of the process of unlearning the things that we have been taught about ourselves, but also to people outside of our communities, what they have been taught about us as well. So searching for truth and continuing to unlearn, but taking action once we learn what we need to. I often think of Black communities and BIPOC communities we're wounded by little daggers. And so these little daggers can be things like microaggressions and racist statements, but they can be big things, systemic things like redlining and the things that we know that led to the Del Mar divide here in St. Louis, or even things just learning about Juneteenth for Black folks that didn't know about it, but also for like white folks who didn't know about it too. So truly see what has prevented our communities from thriving in a whole and healthy way. And being able to listen to that truth telling and those stories and believing those voices, and then taking action within your community. If you're not a BIPOC person, like having active conversations like with family in your legislature, and then direct action. So we all have different capacities. So direct action is also those conversations, but also like getting out in the street, speaking up. This is like messy work, and it's not easy, but it's really needed. And also just acknowledging that healing is a process, mentally, emotionally, psychological, and physical. So it all must be embraced to heal our core.
Lady Ashley, thank you for sharing that. Some of the things that you just harked on around truth, finding your truth, and the healing that must be start, and the unlearning. So we're going to dig into all of that in just a second here. So next up we have Keisha. Keisha, you want to join the conversation?
Sure. Thanks, Laura. It's a pleasure to be here. And I really am excited to be amongst this group of thought leaders and folks working deeply in community to support our advanced healing. I would say that our work at the Deaconess Foundation is really centered around building power amongst community members, amongst leaders who every day are in the trenches, working to improve conditions for families and for young people. And so to kind of expound on what has been shared already, I think empowering individuals, especially individuals that have been most impacted by disinvestment, by systems that have oppressed Black people, and certainly communities of color. Fostering agency really is a big piece of our work, right? Like we have to get out of the way. I have a fancy degree from Washington University, but that doesn't mean a thing, right? I'm still a girl from North St. Louis City. And that's who I bring into the space when I work with our community partners, as well as working with other funders in the region that are hoping to see some significant change happen. And the unfortunate time that we're having right now, I think is a tipping point. I think in order for some substantial change to happen, sometimes some uncomfortable experiences have to occur for us to realize that there can be and there should be different. And so I am eager to continue to work with folks like Lady Ashley and the team over at Forward Through Ferguson and others to support initiatives that will really help to advance the collective healing of our region and supporting greater opportunities for young people that look like me, for young people that have had the similar experiences that I've had, and work for the better.
Absolutely. Thank you, Keisha, for sharing. I know Deaconess is doing great work, and we're going to dig into some of the things that you all are doing in just a second here. Steve.
Well, thank you. First of all, I want to say good morning to everybody and appreciate Generate Health and the staff and Laura for all of the work that you all are doing and putting these series together and allowing this information to go out as far and wide as it possibly can. One of the things that I would say, and I appreciate what both Lady Ashley and Keisha shared, because the critical element of that is making sure that we talk about the birthright of Black and Brown people as human beings and members of the human family. And that birthright really is to be respected, to be responded to, and to be appreciated, and to have our culture and our cultural expression, whatever that is, and our ability to shape and form and to lift up humanity as a part and an equal and thriving part of humanity is certainly something that we deserve and are owed, because the fact is that we're here, and anybody who is here deserves the same respect, appreciation, and autonomy that anybody else has who is here. And so the fact that we're here, we're born, we're coming to this planet, we come into this space as people, as ones who bring something to the table, who have raised humanity to a living and human level historically, and to be treated as less than that really is unacceptable. And we have to become clear that this lesson is a lesson sometimes that our communities have forgotten. And it's not that we've forgotten it because we just forgot it on our own. We were taught something else in order to take the place of our actual reality and our actual history. And those things that have been replaced, that have replaced our real and true history, have taught us to hate ourselves as well as to dehumanize ourselves. And therefore, if you hate yourself or you don't love or respect yourself, it's impossible to love and respect anyone else. And so therefore, forgetting the many, many contributions that we have continued to make, even through all of that, we continue to make contributions to add to the macrocosm and the microcosm that is the human experience. We have not withdrawn, we have not pulled ourselves away from the identity of humanity, even though some may argue that we certainly have a justification in doing so. So since we have not done that, and since we have remained here and remained present and remained vocal about our rights to be and our rights to live and to stand up, then we deserve to continue to do that, and ultimately we deserve to have it. So thank you for allowing us.
Boy, Steve, you just dropped some heavy stuff on us, right? I think the collective voice and central theme of all of your input is really centering around how do we really move through as a collective to a place of healing, a place where we can thrive. And we're not there yet. But what you all have begun to the conversation is for us to get real about our current conditions and how we got here, so we don't continue to, permeate the same problems that we experience. And so I want to dig in a little bit to understanding this thing called generational trauma or historical trauma, and help us better understand what that looks like in community.
Or do you have an order? You want us to stay the same order, or that can we jump in however we like? Oh, you on mute. Hey.
Let's sorry about that. Let's go ahead and go around robin. Steve, I'm gonna ask you to jump in first, and then I'll ask Keisha and Lady Ashley to jump in.
Well, I would say one of the things, if I'm understanding your question correctly, is we have to talk about, the conversation has to really center around the origins of the myth of white skin superiority and how that has contributed to Black skin indifference, right? And so this notion of the fact that when we present ourselves and how we present ourselves as people who are of the original population of the human family gets demeaned, right? And the more culturally connected and the more culturally expressive you are as a person of color, as a Black and brown person, the worse you're treated in some cases. The more you try to integrate or to demolish your own cultural expression, the better your appreciation. But you're still not fully appreciated, because in some circles, you're still demeaned and dehumanized. So I say that one of the things that we have to talk about is the relationship between how people have been trained and how people have been taught about being who you are, and what the punishment has been to people of color for being our beautiful Black and brown selves, right? And so the fact that you couldn't, during one point in our history, we couldn't speak our native languages, because if you did, you suffered a horrible punishment, and that is training. You can't do your cultural practices and celebrations and things like that. Otherwise, you suffer a horrible punishment. And that is training and that is indoctrination to say that you only have the capacity and the ability and the right to accept what we give you, and what someone else gives you can never fully give you a complete sense of self. And so that is the trauma that we continue to carry throughout our communities. And those traumas are replicated through many and many and multiple systems and structural realities that we face every day.
Thank you, Steve. Keisha, you want to weigh in?
I would say that being able to aspire, being able to be hopeful in the midst of what we have been socialized to believe about ourselves, in the midst of systems that have oppressed us, that doesn't mean that we have to remain in the station that we have been in up until this point. I think also as we explore the potential for change, listening to one another, like communication, right? What does that look like within our community for elders to listen to the youth and young people who we know have been on the front lines and are on the front lines of the current and most recent uprisings? But also for the young people and young adults to listen and understand the journeys and pathways that have got us to this moment from our elders, right? There are lessons to be learned about experiences that have already been had, but there is certainly a space and a place to respect, honor, and advance the urgency, right? The urgency of this current moment. And so I think listening to one another will help us understand how we can continue to move forward on a path forward, but also making sure that we have some hope and we live into that hope. I don't mean to be hokey. I'm not hearkening back to the Obama years. I'm just saying that, you know, just because systems have been designed to operate a certain way, that does not mean that that is the way that we have to live our lives. And we can always have a choice. It's that agency thing again, right? We always have a choice about what it is that we want for our lives. And so I'm encouraging all of us to move in a space of aspiration and hope.
Thank you for sharing that, Keisha. Lady Ashley?
Thank you, Keisha. That was beautiful. So being kind of like a part psychology student, I think of generational trauma and what I've learned about how it can be very like neurally linked in our brains, but also how I kind of reject that. And I wanted to share something with you all as a quote that I came across that has really shown up in my life recently. And part of that quote of "I knew I was healing when I saw my parents as people with their own unresolved trauma." And I've been thinking about conversations that I've been having with my mom and with my aunt, and how many of the things that they have experienced personally that were also systemic were passed down. And that generational trauma, what makes it generational trauma is that it's unresolved, right? We haven't looked at a way to heal from it, to make it better for ourselves, for our families, and even for our ancestors, if we want to look at doing like that ancestry work. So unresolved emotions, what does that look like? Where do those feelings come from? Leaning into those feelings and understanding them, even if they're uncomfortable. Realizing the place that eugenics has had in our culture to make us look down upon ourselves, our beauty, our skin color, our melanin, and how those patterns are repeated when society tells us that Black folks specifically are very monolithic, when we're not. We know that we're very different, and there are different aspects to our personalities and our cultures. So breaking away from the trauma of believing that we only have to be one way that has been passed down. I also think forming connections to land around us. I was having a conversation with my friend who does a lot of history lessons, and he was saying, we're the only group of folks that aren't named after a land. Most people can connect to a land and a language, and we don't have that because much of our ancestry, our people, we were stolen from a place that we have to find connection to, or we don't. So reconnecting with land, getting rid of the ideas that we've been trained that we need to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, that we always have to be resilient and strong, reframing our ideas, and I think also reframing ritual, like Keisha said, to find that joy, to find that hope. I try to wake up every day and look for one thing that I can love and enjoy that's free, whether it be like the way the sun feels on my face, or the wind blowing just to make me feel cooler, to kind of get away from like this capitalistic mindset that so many of us are set in. So I think unlearning those patterns of capitalism, of Blackness being a monolithic identity, of eugenics and the part that's played in our histories, and breaking those negative patterns to start to resolve that generational trauma that we carry with us. And I told my mom this at the beginning of the year when we had a conversation. I was like, I love you, I respect you, but generational trauma will stop with me. And we've been working on it. So it's also having those conversations as well.
Wow, that's powerful. And thank you for sharing. All of you all, thank you for sharing. As you were talking, things that kind of kept bubbling up were, what are the barriers that make community healing difficult? As you all are talking about, the truths and the experiences, what makes it difficult for our communities to heal? Steve, you want to weigh in? Then we're going around.
Yeah, there's a lot to that question. Oof, multi-phasic answer. So one of the things, so if I'm understanding the question correctly, you ask, what are the barriers to healing? I think I would start with first this kind of rampant distrust and mistrust. I think with the rise of the idea of individualism and individualistic mindset, it creates distance and dissonance between people who were very interconnected, interdependent, and interrelated, right? That is a normal aspect of how communities thrive and communities overcome whatever that community faces. And I happen to be old enough to have grown up in maybe the last vestiges of the Great Ville neighborhood. And when our community and being able to see kind of how the relationships of people who came to this area from the South and how creating community did allow you a certain amount of strength and fortitude to overcome and deal with things that happened to you as a community as a whole, because you knew that you had other people who could back you up, and not just your immediate or biological family, but there were many, many people in the community. If I was a child and I was had some issue going on and I was around the corner, I knew the people on that block whose house I could go to get help or to get support. And I think not having those kinds of relationships, one of the things that I would focus on is not having the kind of trust and not being able to encourage ourselves to trust each other enough to develop that kind of community and that kind of neighbor to neighbor and friend to friend relationship has become a true and significant disservice to our ability to build and create community and find healing in each other, because there's always an elder down the block who can tell you more about how to lift yourself up and how, as Keisha mentioned about, and Lady Ashley mentioned about, to find that joy and to what things to let roll off your back like a duck, which things to not pay attention to, which things that all you have to do is sleep on this baby and wake up in the morning and the sun will shine, it'll be all right. A new day will teach you a new lesson. So I think those things are the things that we have not had. And so in the way that we've had it before. I'll also say, unfortunately, the lack of relationship between elders and the lack of elders in our community. We don't have elders in the same way. When I drive through a community, I'm like, well, where are the community elders at? Where are they? You know, we don't have them the same way that we used to. And we certainly don't respect the same way that we used to. So I think those are some significant barriers. There are others, but I'll stop there to let these brilliant young women speak.
That they are. Keisha, you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I appreciate Steve's comments relative to the breaking down of community, right? So we talk about how systems are designed to dismantle connectivity for us. And because those systems are designed that way, and because we then have been socialized that way, we don't trust one another. We don't feel that we can be vulnerable with one another. You know what I mean? Because we're constantly on the defense for what is coming out or coming towards us from the outside world. And in as much as that is a defense mechanism to protect ourselves, to survive on a day-to-day basis, I think that leaves us at a great disadvantage, to Steve's point, to create proximity and relationship within our community. And so I think that vulnerability with one another, to know that we can be open with one another, I think has been a challenge, because we are constantly in self-protection mode. And I think in order for us to move past kind of our current survival mode, we'll have to kind of shed some of those layers, right? In order to move forward and see some different experiences and have some different experiences, trusting one another definitely, and having vulnerability and feeling safe to have said vulnerability.
Right, absolutely. Absolutely. Lady Ashley?
Yes, thank you. I think, what our last two panelists have said about trust and vulnerability, definitely acceptance of everybody in our community that may or may not identify in the same ways that we do, I think is very important. I see people a lot of times not being accepted authentically. And due to that, we see even in Missouri, we've had laws and legislature passed against, LGBTQ plus folks, just basically denying them access to basic needs, health, housing. I think it's really frustrating when we think of building resilience and healing, that a lot of times we haven't had systems in place to help us succeed. And so many times we see, like, I call them our family members, those friends who are as close as family, that chosen community, continuing to create and build systems to lift each other up. And it works, right? We see the radical, amazing way that it works, but the capacity to keep those things going and the things that they need to be supported is often not there. Outside of something that is a trend, whether it is another Black person that has been murdered or a name that is a hashtag. We see people rush to assistance like during those times, but outside of that, we don't see the same level, I don't want to say urgency, but of importance of rush assistance that we would need to continue to exist and build on a healthy level. Basically, systems in St. Louis, real systems like for rental assistance, forgiveness, shelter for the unhoused communities. We're talking about the expansion of Medicaid right now, so we're seeing like health disparities. Voting is a big one. Suppression, accessibility to resources, especially during a pandemic. talking to people about mail-in ballots or voting absentee, giving them the resources that they need to learn to also push us forward. And also kind of, I think, in relation to COVID-19 and what's happening, the idea of so many people wanting to go back to normal, but realizing that normal for a lot of us never worked. So we have to reinvest in people and reinvest in each other, and shift our thought processes to listen to people and say, this is what I need to survive and succeed and excel. And it may be different than what society has always taught us is necessary. It may not be that, degree. It may not be that lesson plan. It may not be that path, but investing in each other and kind of opening up our vision to hold more of what people are able to do in an alternative way, I feel like.
Thank you, Lady Ashley. Before we kind of shift our conversation to kind of what's happening on the ground, the initiatives that are underway, and the great work that's happening to address this, there was a couple questions I thought might be appropriate to field at this point. That have relevancy to what has been happening in our conversation thus far. And so I want to throw out one question, and it's a question I'm going to throw out and just ask anyone to be able to address. And the question is, do we have anything that can coach our community and people to unlearn the negative lies that have been consciously or subconsciously given to us? Anybody can answer.
I think for me as an individual, it started looking at folks who were doing kind of like these unlearning. So I started following a teacher, an activist, an author. Her name is Rachel Cargill, and she actually has a system plan called The Great Unlearn. She is a Black woman, also finding other blogs and social media sites, the ghetto activists, like stepping outside of what we normally go for, to knowledge, to understand like our history, and to know that our history did not start with chattel slavery, which is what we are taught in school. So being able to step beyond that, looking for those other resources that teach us more than where we thought we started or where we've been taught that we started. So look, and those are community members too who can teach you those things. So for me, it was just basically looking for those resources to unlearn, for sure.
Anything else you want to add in the space?
I think there's a lot there. There's a lot of things that have happened. I think we have to start first with reconnecting to our history and reconnecting to those things that always have been our strengths and always have lifted us up, always have created community for us. And I think those things happen both in multi layers as well as individually, right? We've had multiple rebirths of, what some of us call consciousness and awokeness in throughout of our history, that causes people to want to invest or to delve further into understanding what has been the truth of our reality going way, way, way before we came here in the holds of slave ships. There's way more history of people of color prior to that than there are since then. That history is age old. I heard it said once that our history can't even be found in the rocks in the bottom of the ocean. It's so old. So I think we need to really understand and invest in that and teaching those lessons to ourselves and our young people, and allowing and making sure that those relationships and those of us who are in this kind of middle age, I consider myself in that space. I'm not an elder, I'm not a youth, have to be bridges between older people and young people, and make sure that that history and that learning of living continues to go back to our young people, thinking about Sankofa idea that in West Africa, in Ghana, that says that we have to go back and fetch it. We have to go back and understand what is our reality, what is our understanding, what is our true history, and what have we done? What have our people done? What have people who look like us, what have we done to create power, beauty, and community? And if we recognize those things, it kind of informs how we live in the future. A tree without roots, as it's been said, cannot produce fruit. So we have to do that.
Thank you for those comments. I have a request for all of the panelists to put your name and your information in the chat. Folks are blowing up wanting to know who you are and how to get a hold of you, even following up after this session. So if you can do that, that'd be great. Another question that was raised was, how do we get the trust back from each other as a people, as a community? How do we do that?
I would say to the point I made earlier about creating a space for vulnerability and then mutually creating a space for safety, right? I'm a social worker by trade. And so I enter into any relationship with someone, honoring them as the individual that they are. I think Lady Ashley made a great point around acceptance. And though, I have been raised a certain way, I have a certain belief and value system, I still have to honor you with what you bring to the table and create a space for you to be safe in who you are and who you show up to be. And hopefully expect the same from you to create a safe space for me to be my most vulnerable and present self. So I think vulnerability and creating safe space for one another, I think will help in that.
Yeah, safer spaces are key. And in my life, they have always been things that have been created because they weren't there, which is sad, but true. I think for me personally, that I've learned to help me and people in my life is setting healthy boundaries in work and personal relationships. To do this, you have to know yourself, and you have to have that vulnerability and being able to have those conversations with people around you. So there's setting boundaries and there's setting healthy boundaries. And I think when you go into relationships with people, whether they be friendships or elsewise or otherwise, like you say, hey, this is what I need for us to be able to coexist in a space together. And the person can say, this is something I can do, or this is something that I can't do. And it can save everyone a lot of time. I think also listening to each other, and that's listening with more than just your ears, listening with your heart and mind, listening not to just develop a response, but to hear and digest, and also just doing the self-work of acknowledging your emotions. Realizing that when we are angry or when we are scared, sometimes those are our secondary emotions and they come from other emotions through experiences and places. So leaning into that, acknowledging where they come from, and if those are responses, what you have to do to work on them to garner other emotions that can help you in a healthier, more whole way. So understanding yourself in that way too.
Yeah, appreciating what's been said already. I don't feel the need to repeat it. I think the lady illustrated it beautifully. One thing that I would add is, I think, always speaking truth, right? Your truth for sure. Always making sure that we push on the narrative that there's a reason to code switch, right? I think we have to start at some point breaking down those environments that require us to be somebody other than who we naturally are. And once we begin to undo those systems, then we won't have to feel the need to change and be this way in one environment and that way when we go home and when we go around our friends and our family. And then when we go to work, we're a different person, because you know that reality when somebody comes like that, if they remind you any way at all of those people who you don't trust and who you know are quote unquote fake, you're going to put them in that box and they're going to forever live there. And there goes the trust. We have to undo that reality and begin to work on that so that we can begin to see each other naturally and appreciate each other naturally for who we are, and living really in our real selves out loud, and whatever that looks like, and however that shows up. And recognize that it is the beauty of humanity that we all represent multiple different expressions of, the one that we have.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you all for sharing. One last question before we kind of do a round robin of diving in on what you're doing, what you're working on, is has the introduction of drugs into the community been a factor of creating disintegration and mistrust?
Oh, I'm already unmuted, so why don't I jump in? I would say absolutely. I think though drugs are a manifestation of dissatisfaction that was already there, I think that, the community that's already decimated for a lot of different, in a lot of different ways, really drugs are just a way for people to escape. If your reality is sufficient, if your reality is beautiful, if your reality is in accordance to who you are, there's nothing to escape from, right? You're escaping from a reality that is oppressive, that is racist, that is dehumanizing, that doesn't value you as a person. So I think drugs are something that was an easy economic venture for some people, but also that further dehumanized people and created further division, because now there's just another reason to see people as not valuable or as less than. Because we already know in our community, crackheads are looked at in a particular way. So, and that is a reality, unfortunately, that we have, that's been created through drugs and drug use, and not recognizing that this poison is a symptom of other poisons and the larger poison that we're all victims of. Right? So, of course, drugs have been, but drugs aren't a thing unto themselves just for the sake of it.
I think that is a very good point. And I also want to look at like the systemic history of drugs as well. Many drugs today that we have in society have been taken and altered by white leadership and placed into Black communities and communities of color. But before they were taken and altered and then criminalized, many drugs, such as cocaine, which originally came from the Kawaka plant, which was used by indigenous folks in ceremonies for healing and for crossing over to the other side. They were being used in healthy ways in history, and it wasn't until they were taken and co-opted through colonialism and turned into negative things and had gasoline added to them and then sent into Black communities and communities of color that they became bad. When you look at indigenous folks, so if you want to look at drugs in the form of alcohol, when they were moved from their land that they owned, one of the things that was rationed in their supplies was whiskey that was given to them, which was something that they weren't used to, but something that they were allowed to have. And so we look at the effect on that on indigenous populations now, and we see alcoholism is higher there. We think of medical drugs and the price of them, but also how we see youth growing up and they have energy, but they are given medicine to suppress emotions and feelings that they should naturally be having because parents don't want to deal with it or can't deal with it or don't know how to have the resources to deal with it. So also looking at responses of things to that. within certain communities. If it's not a Black or brown community, it's an illness or an epidemic. But if it is in a Black or brown community, we are crackheads and drug addicts. So being able to name that and call it out and say that's not right, we are criminalized unfairly, and you have taken a history of using resources from the land that were sacred to so many Indigenous folks and being used in right and healthy ways and altered them and placed them in our communities negatively. So also knowing that history as well.
Thank you, Lady Ashley. I always learn so much when I am in company with you, and I appreciate Steve's remarks as well. I think to the earlier point that was made around the survival mode that we're in, right? Drugs often used as self-medication, right? We think about trauma and we think about resiliency. And so often generations of young people, individuals have not had the skills to build their coping mechanisms to be able to thrive beyond the trauma impacts that they have experienced. And so they look to substances like drugs, like alcohol and the like, just to be able to navigate and exist within this current plane. And so, you know, I think making sure that we are supporting young people, we are supporting young children, we're supporting moms, right? To be able for their own coping mechanisms and building and maximizing and elevating their own coping mechanisms, but also instilling that in their children, so that in the long term, hopefully they have even more resiliency to be able to thrive versus just kind of surviving in these current systems.
Mm-hmm. So also, I'd like us to just maybe switch gears a little bit here and talk a little bit about what your individual organizations and groups that you may be engaged with are doing to kind of address trauma and move us towards healing. Lady Ashley, want to start us off?
I will. So Forward Through Ferguson, since its inception, which is from the Ferguson Commission that was formed after the murder of Mike Brown, is dedicated to having a more racially equitable St. Louis by 2039. In doing that, we have a director of racial equity capacity that supports the community through racial healing and justice. So Forward Through Ferguson is a wayfinder, and they help people and institutions find a starting point and strategize their journey, create practices, and talk about how to be held radically accountable and be a partner in systems change. So through workshops and assessments, they have a racial equity, diversity and inclusion roundtable series for practitioners to build synergy and measure progress towards racial equity. They also have a systems change primer, which is really amazing, that basically focuses on systems change methodology tied to achieving racial equity. And they actually created one this year for elected officials in St. Louis, which I think is really important. So if you have any elected officials, specifically Black elected officials, please tell them about this on our website. They can apply to join the session by Friday. And we also have a racial equity capacity assessment for surveying stakeholders and organizations. Something that I am in charge of leading the initiative, and we've been so lucky to work with the Deaconess Foundation and folks from Generate Health and Empower Institute to start engagement this summer to launch the Racial Healing and Justice Fund. As we talked about, like, we cannot do this work separately. Healing and justice are one and the same truth. We have to change these conditions that reinforce systemic racial inequities. So this engagement period that we have through the summer with residents, with healing practitioners, with organizers, is going to lead to forming a community governance structure that actually grants money to the community to focus on racial healing and justice. So the healing is going to be focusing on creating space for truth narratives, restoration, providing support, and building individual power. Justice, of course, changing the conditions by giving opportunities of regular investment and support within the community, centering and growing grassroots knowledge and cherishing lived experience and knowledge outside of that institutional knowledge that we know of. And also just broadening resident and community engagement so people can hold each other accountable and uplifting the mobilization of community. So I call this, I laugh when I say this is a for us, by us fund. It's gonna align local and national philanthropy and community set priorities within a community-led grant-making structure that puts racial equity and healing justice at the center for our community. And that is what I'm really excited about. But Forward Through Ferguson, I've learned they're a tiny but mighty team, but they jump in and they have feet on the ground wherever they can, whether it's legislation with Close the Workhouse or Action STL or Art City or Generate Health there, and a little bit of everything. But just achieving that racial equity is key for us by 2039.
What an amazing map. When I looked at that, it's so detail oriented, but really speaks truth to power of what anchors we already have in our community that we can search for and really help become part of the solution. And that's what I'm here, kind of taking away from this fund that's different than what we've had traditionally in our community.
Yeah. And I shared the map with you. I forgot to ask you to show it to folks so they can kind of get an overview of what this fund would look like. Would you mind showing it real quick? Just so people.
She actually just had it on the screen.
Awesome. I had it on speaker view, so I couldn't see.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Fabulous.
If anybody would like a copy of that, you can get in contact with me. It's also on our website for the Racial Healing and Justice Fund.
Great. Thank you, Lady Ashley. Keisha, you want to weigh in on what Deaconess is doing?
Sure. Thank you, Laura. Certainly big ups to our colleagues over at Forward Through Ferguson for their leadership and experience in working deeply with engaging and connecting community to the Racial Healing Fund, the Regional Racial Healing Fund. Deaconess Foundation, along with 10 other initial local and national funders, have been working to bring these resources to fruition for community, right? To Lady Ashley's point, for community to be able to decide what does it mean to heal, what is needed to heal, and what is needed to thrive in the long term. And so right now, to Lady Ashley's point, and in the map that you saw, I love that visual. They are in a design process. Anybody who is interested in being a part of that design process can certainly connect with Lady Ashley and go to Forward Through Ferguson's website, and that will be scaffolded to a actual grant making launch in the fall. And so as a funding partner, Deaconess Foundation, along with others, are in the background of this entire process. We do grant making every day, right? But that doesn't mean that we need to decide or determine what this process looks like. Our goal every day is to make sure that community has the space and again, that agency to be able to decide what is important and what is most valuable for community. And so if that means that our systems and our infrastructure can be leveraged and is leveraged to make sure that happens, that is what Deaconess Foundation is doing. We are working in partnership with others like the Missouri Foundation for Health to maximize and leverage our existing resources to make sure that Forward Through Ferguson has what they need to advance this work, but certainly that the community leadership group will have what they need over the course of the next 3 years. So we're really, really excited about the Racial Healing Pool Fund. really being a living embodiment of recommendations coming from the Ferguson Commission report. So it's a really exciting initiative. The other thing that I would say relative to the work that we're doing at Deaconess Foundation in the space of supporting community in this current moment as we think about the crisis of the pandemic, we have launched in late April the Equitable Relief and Recovery Fund. That is a grant opportunity specifically for Black-led organizations that are providing immediate relief to communities across our region, addressing the needs of neighborhoods, families who are experiencing the disproportionate impacts of COVID-19. And so we have partnered with Robert Wood Johnson Foundation to be able to provide a really significant resource over the past few months to community members. And we have been so grateful that we have been able to connect with 90 Black-led organizations, many of whom were not on our specific radar. And we are so grateful to be able to connect with those organizations, to be able to get them resources, to be able to do the work that they're doing, providing PPE or providing food or providing rental assistance in some instances, providing maybe mental health or substance abuse supports, again, thinking about the trauma of this current moment and the experiences that some folks might be having. And so we still have a rolling process that is open and available for the Equitable Relief and Recovery Fund. I shared in the chat box the link to our Deaconess Foundation website. You go to our website and there is a tab up front that says, what do we fund? Once you click on that tab, it will take you to all of our funding opportunities that will list the Equitable Relief and Recovery Fund, and it's a very quick application. We are eager to make sure that community has this resource because we know right now is a tenuous time for all of our fellow community members, and we want to be able to provide resources to kind of help to be able to navigate right now in this moment.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you, Keisha, for sharing that, what Deaconess is doing. Steve, you want to put something in the space?
Well, I appreciate all of the work that's going on. I certainly appreciate all of the pre-work and the work that has gone into both organizations, projects and things that they're doing in and for community. One of the things that occurs to me is that I would like to see all of us, as Keisha mentioned, those various organizations, I would like to see a lot of us think about what coordination and relationship building looks like, not just between organizations and systems, but between organization, systems, and community, and how we build bridges between all three. Because I think in order to get back to the point of trust, as we talked about earlier, we're going to have to be about relationship-based community engagement and relationship-based people building. So I think that as we move forward, it would be good for those of us who are in the know and in these spaces to talk about and to connect on what that looks like. How do we build relationships? How do we break down these walls of silos that we have in St. Louis and the region in particular, and begin to think and look at ourselves all as agents of change who are all might have different lanes or lenses that we operate from, but all have taken on this responsibility of doing good work for a community. And how do we connect better? And how do we coordinate better so that when community looks across the landscape of people who say they're doing this work, they see these relationships and we model the behavior that we're encouraging in community. Because when we go in community and talk about, hey, we should see ourselves as connected and more interrelated, but they look across the landscape and see all of us separate and distinct and disconnected. It kind of doesn't model what we're saying we want to promote. So I'm saying that good work, we appreciate all the work. Let's go forward and think about how we show a model to ourselves and our community that look different.
So Steve, this challenge to us all, right? To connect these dots because we know what's at stake. And I'd like to have you all weigh in on the actions that folks can take to get involved. How do they begin to advocate for equity and community healing, and what groups are already taking action that they can be a part of? Are there advocacy efforts? Weigh in on what you think folks can do to kind of be a part of this movement.
I would say one big thing is be the bullhorn, right? Say, call it out when you see injustice, call it out. Everybody doesn't call things out the same way. So recognize that I'm saying that I'm not asking everybody to do the same thing at the same time in the same way. But I am saying that all of us, if we, in whatever way we can, recognize and say and call out what we see as unjust, what we see as creating division, and what we see as dehumanizing, that we, begin to identify those things so that we can work on it collectively, and so we can bring what our knowledge base is to the solution to each other, share it, and then spread it as much as possible. So that's one thing that I would say.
I agree with you there. I think knowledge sharing is huge. Resource sharing is very important. If you find something that has helped you, more than likely it can help someone else. So don't hold it in. Going back to unlearning, what we've been taught, especially if we find that it is serving white supremacy, the patriarchy, and colonialism. If there isn't space for like BIPOC folks to thrive from these systems, and we know that they weren't created like with us even in mind, like start breaking down that info and assisting like each other and our communities in building those new systems. There's so many folks and orgs that are doing the work in St. Louis, big and small. The folks that are here, Generate Health, Arch City, Close the Workhouse, Empower Institute. And as a whole, I think through these grassroots organizations and their supporters, I'm just learning how to be proactive and having like conversations and challenging ourselves to think bigger, experience bigger, and feel bigger, and lean into the discomfort we have surrounding that. And yeah, just continuing to share those resources as they come about with people around you, for sure. We're doing a community engagement survey on one of the websites that I listed in the chat box. That's another way to get in contact with Forward Through Ferguson, to be engaged through the Racial Healing and Justice Fund throughout the process and through its launch, and what we continue to do with it after that. So if you're interested, please go and fill out that survey, and we'll be able to contact you to keep you in the loop regarding that and other things.
I would say Deaconess Foundation supports so many different partners that are deeply connected to advancing greater conditions for child well-being and family well-being in the long term. Our newsletter comes out on a monthly basis and often has information relative to issues and topics that are of import, whether it's Medicaid expansion, whether it's the Close the Workhouse campaign, again, all advanced through partners like Forward Through Ferguson, like Action St. Louis, like Organization for Black Struggle. And so if you go to our website, which again, I shared within the chat box, there is a link at the top of the page around our advocacy. And you can get connected to current advocacy alerts or our e-newsletter to stay apprised, or any of our social media platforms, quite honestly, to stay apprised of particular actions that can be taken to advance the progress that we all would like to see in our region.
Awesome, thank you. This is amazing, amazing start of a conversation. Before we kind of bring this to a close, someone wanted to know, Steve, for you to explain the art behind you.
Hmm. This. Oh, this. Okay. Interesting. All right. So that's a who knew that was gonna come up, but all right. So this is one of the things that I'm very interested in always promoting um, Black history and making sure that we are always stay connected to our reality and our greatness. So historically, this is a photo, a depiction of the one of the ancient Kemetic um, expressions of the creator, um, Heru, who is going on a journey, a boat, who is going through the journey of the underworld and coming back to the light. And so you see the eye of Heru, or the eye of Tahuti there. The boat has the eye on it and represents him going through trials and becoming a warrior king. And you see the sun disk and the snake encapsulated around it on his head to represent power, knowledge, and lifting up of the beauty and history of that civilization and his commitment to change, strength, and power. And the sun has the rays of the sun have hands coming out of it, which represent the life-giving energy of sunlight and our relationship to how it activates and creates life in those of us who are melanated. And it also has an ankh at the top of it, which represents its giving light and power. So that's the short, quick explanation. Uh,
Well, you
Thank you
did a
for
great
whoever
job.
asked that. Thank you for whoever asked that. I was thinking I was on a whole nother page, so I had to switch gears to even think about it. Like I've not even explained it in a while. So thank you for the question.
Yeah, and thank you for sharing. As we all are learning, we've got a lot to learn and unlearn, as Lady Ashley spoke of. I want to just create just a little space for any closing remarks from our panelists.
Thank you all for being here. Thank you to Laura and Generate Health for having us and facilitating like a great conscious conversation. These are conversations that we need to continue to have to enlighten ourselves, but I feel to also continue to lift each other up. So thanks to everybody who also like tuned in and tagged along for this conversation, because I know in my heart that you all are doing this work in your own way too, and I appreciate you for it.
I want to say thank you, Laura and Kendra and the entire Generate Health team for just offering the opportunity to share community with these wonderful, brilliant panelists, and to share a little bit about the work that our partners are doing, and certainly look forward to crossing paths with each of the participants if they have questions about some of the efforts that we have going on with the Deaconess Foundation. So really humbled to be a part of the chat this morning. Thank you.
So first, I want to say again, thank you. Echo the thanks to Generate Health and to Laura for helping to guide us through, doing a great job of guiding us through this conversation and helping us to bring out what was shared. I want to say thank you to Lady Ashley and Keisha for being brilliant and for giving us all things to think about and to go out and go forth, to marinate on it as we do our work. I also want to say thanks to the people who are participating for listening and allowing us to share our thoughts, our opinions. We know that all of us are important mechanisms, important components to a collective whole. And it will take all of us, and certainly more than of us than the people who are on this panel or even who are listening and watching to do this work. And it is something that if we all engage in, we can get it done. And it's being done. And the beauty of it is that once we've moved into this space, and as we collectively work together, we find community in ways and in spaces that we had not imagined. So I think the love and the joy and the beauty of this will continue. And thank you for giving us this time, space, energy, and sharing your time, your energy, your vision with us.
Thank you to our panelists, and just a special shout out to Generate Health's team who works behind the scenes to make these webinars happen every other week, I should say. I do want to put a shout out in the space to support Medicaid expansion by voting yes on 2. It will be on the ballot box August 4th, and there's an opportunity for us. You may go to Generate Health's website under the advocacy tab to access our full Medicaid expansion campaign toolkit that can equip you with all you need to help support you in making a case for why Medicaid expansion is needed. I want to close with a quote that I actually found from Rebecca Bennett that is just so poignant for to leave it with us. And it goes, "No single institution, government, or organization has the insight, resources, or manpower to resolve nearly 400 years of racial inequities. This is an undertaking that is bigger than each of us, though not greater than all of us." I leave you with that. And thank you so much for your time today. Stay safe. So long.